All right, in this video lecture number 6, we're going to start talking about this subsection of the Monahan and Walker book entitled Methods of Gathering Information. That starts there on page 69 of the book. So we know the first job in conducting scientific research is to choose variables and then to operationally define them in a reliable way and a valid way. But then, of course, you have to gather data that can hopefully answer your research question or questions. And this is all about research design. And there are many, many possible research designs, each with their own pros and cons, limitations, and potential methodological problems. There's never going to be a perfect research design, but for each study, the researcher just has to decide which potential problems are the most important to avoid. And in research design, we look at validity again in a little different way than just looking at a particular measurement of one variable. So when we talk about validity of a research design, we're going to look at two kinds of validity, internal and external validity. Now, ideally, a great research design will allow you to maximize both of these, but very often one or the other gets slightly compromised. So internal validity just refers to the validity of a study on its own terms, sort of within the four corners of the study. Were the methods sound enough to justify the conclusions that were reached in the study itself? Or another way of putting it, does this study have a good logical structure that will allow us to draw inferences about cause and effect if we analyze our results? Now, external validity, on the other hand, is concerned with how far the results of a given study can be generalized to other populations or people or other settings or other times. So, I'm a scientist, I got a certain result in my study. Can I predict that my results would be replicatable in a similar population, for example? So let's go back to a study on jury size to illustrate internal versus external validity. So we want to test whether there are functional differences between juries of 6 people versus 12. So I'm going to talk about some potential pitfalls in some study structures to show you how those choices might threaten either your internal validity or your external validity. So first, let's imagine we designed our study of 6-person and 12-person juries, and we decided to compare state cases that used 12-person juries with federal cases that used 6-person juries. Now that is going to raise internal validity concerns. Now why is that? Well, that's because any differences that we observe in jury functioning between our 6 and 12-member mock juries could, of course, be due to the difference between federal and state defendants and prosecutors if it's a criminal case, federal and state plaintiffs and defendants if it's a civil case, differences in federal and state judges or jurors, or even the types of cases that you're going to get in those two systems. So our results here in this study are going to be suspect right off the bat, just within the four corners of the study, just on its own terms, and that's before we even try to make more general statements using our data. Okay, well now, how about a study that uses all state cases? So we're choosing all state cases, so we're going to avoid that earlier problem of mixing state and federal cases. And we're going to look at 12-person versus 6-person juries in civil cases. And let's say we find definite differences in whatever functioning we're measuring. So far, so good. There might be great internal validity, at least from what we know so far. Now, I should throw in here that on this internal validity front, we are still going to want to look at whether the cases were all from one state, which might be preferable, or at least whether the cases were all from states that we could argue were very similar on as many characteristics as possible. So all of those things are going to affect internal validity. But even assuming good internal validity, because let's say all our cases were from one state, Might we have an external validity problem here? What problems could you foresee in generalizing our results to other populations or other places? Well, for one, if we did our study using a civil case in only one state, we'd have to worry about whether we'd be able to generalize our findings to state civil cases elsewhere, to different states, or in particular to particularly dissimilar states. We'd certainly want to figure out what kinds of differences between states might affect external validity in this context. And certainly also we'd have an issue generalizing the findings to criminal cases, whether in the state that we studied at hand or other states. So all of these are issues of external validity or generalizability of the study. Okay, now focusing just on internal validity, we know that studies that are interested in finding a cause and effect relationship, they're going to start with a hypothesis, right? Ideally derived from a theory, like the diagram we saw the other day, and designing a study to test her hypothesis is then going to try to think of any plausible rival hypotheses, right, that could also conceivably produce the effect. And then the study will be designed to try to eliminate the other plausible hypotheses one at a time. And if the only hypothesis you can't eliminate is your original one, it is then much more likely to be true, right? Unless, of course, someone else thinks up a new plausible hypothesis that knocks yours right out of the box. But anyway, a simple explanation of the general idea is that hypothesis testing proceeds by the process of elimination. And you ideally would love to design your study in a way in which cause can be inferred directly from your effect by eliminating any confounding variables. And that way, you don't have to rely on more complicated statistical analyses to try to support your cause and effect connection. But, like I say on the slide, even if you do everything on the list, you still might run into problems. Some plausible alternative hypotheses occur so often in scientific studies that they are known as threats to internal validity, and they almost always have to be considered and taken into account when a scientist is designing research, at least to the extent possible. So these are the 7 major threats within a research protocol, within a protocol or a methodology that might undermine the confidence in the scientist's stated relationship between the independent and dependent variables. So what these major threats to internal validity do is to make the causation inferences weaker and more ambiguous. So good research programs are going to attempt to minimize as much as possible these 7 best-known dangers to internal validity. The Monahan-Walker book has good examples on pages 64 through 66 of some of the main threats to validity, and I'm going to try to complement that, try to give you at least some different examples here. Okay, the first threat is the history threat. So this refers to the possibility that the effect you're seeing in your research is due to an extraneous event rather than the effect of your independent variable. So, for example, the first one on the slide here, researchers, let's say you're studying a new law school brochure that was specifically designed to attract women law students. And let's say the researchers find that more women did apply to law school after the brochure than before. So the question is, what might the history threat here be? Well, the major one that I can think of is that more women are applying to law school anyway. You could certainly look at trend lines from, say, the past decade or so, and if you see a steady upward trend in female law student applications, you might be very concerned about attributing more female applicants to your brochure. So that would be a history threat. Some other ones. How about this one? If you did a study on the effects of a state cigarette tax increase on cigarette sales, maybe that will produce data that shows a decrease in sales and therefore presumably a decrease in smoking. But if at about the same time as the tax was put into place, if the state also launched a major anti-smoking campaign, that could be a history threat to your data and a history threat to your being able to attribute the decrease in smoking to the tax. Patients in a study might be randomized so that one group receives a certain drug treatment as compared to a control group, but if those treated patients in the drug treatment group are at the same time also placed on a special diet or given additional therapies that the other group isn't, you can't necessarily infer that any differences between groups resulted from your drug treatment. So also potential history threat. And then here's one that actually shows up when people are arguing about global warming sometimes. A study showing a correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide levels produced by humans and a rise in the Earth's average temperature could be threatened if the recorded temperature rises could also just be a function of the natural variations in climate rather than carbon dioxide produced by humans. Now, all of these threats to internal validity, these and more that we could think of, might not be completely fatal, but they certainly should be acknowledged by the researchers and minimized as much as possible if there is a possible way to do it. With the global warming example, you'd want to look very closely at those past temperature fluctuations and analyze any similarities and differences in addition to looking at the data on how long those cycles were in the past as opposed to what is going on in the present day. In addition to, of course, you're going to want to continue to gather data. Okay, the next one, maturation. As the name suggests, the effect shown in your data might be due to the maturation of your subjects. Now, maybe a better way of putting this is to, define it a little differently to avoid confusion about the word maturation simply meaning people becoming more mature. We can say that maturation really deals with any process that might be going on within the research subjects or respondents to a survey and so forth. Like, are they getting older? Are they getting tired? Are they getting bored? Are they getting hungry? Or in our medical treatment example, we always have the body's natural healing mechanisms as a maturation confound, right? Would a certain percentage of our patients in the treatment group have gotten better on their own, even without the treatment? Now, one of my favorite historical examples of that is the 18th century medical treatment of bleeding people with leeches to draw out their toxic humors for every kind of illness. Now, certainly some people were apparently cured of their illnesses by bleeding with leeches because they survived all that blood loss and they still recovered. But we can imagine that those people would have gotten better on their own anyway. Now, if you have a carefully constructed control group along with your, the research group that you're going to give the treatment or, put the independent variable to work on, if your control group is carefully constructed, maybe you can assume that an equal number of, say, patients in the control group, if we're talking about a drug study on people who are sick or something, you can assume that an equal number of patients in the control group will get better on their own, just like an equal number of patients in your treatment group would have gotten better without the treatment. So the effect is going to be balanced out there, and you can still have confidence that any differences in the treatment group are due to your treatment over and above the body's natural healing. The other interesting one on the slide down here The Monahan and Walker book gives this law school example in the section on the maturity threat. Many studies find that law students become more conservative through law school, using the operational definition of conservative as whether students want to go into public interest work or not. Uh, Going into public interest work is defined as being less conservative. So the studies find that fewer students profess an interest in public interest work at the end of their third year as compared to the beginning of their first year, or even in their law school applications. So does law school itself make students more conservative, make students less desirous, sort of internally, of doing public interest work? Or might the studies just reflect the maturational effect of being 3 years older? Or I was thinking to look back at the other threat we've already talked about already. Can you think of a possible history threat? How about all that law school debt? If you have to pay off loans, you might not be able to afford to take that lower paying public interest job if a higher paying one is available to you. So that would be a completely independent cause altogether as well. Now, there's probably another threat here too, and that is the possibility that some students who professed a desire to go into public interest work in their applications, for example, just said that because they thought it would make them more desirable candidates for the law school. So really, we would say those people were miscategorized in their group in the very beginning. And I'm not sure exactly which of the 7 deadly threats that would be fit under, probably selection bias. Okay, the testing threat. Now, familiarity with a test certainly can affect performance. For example, any differences in LSAT score from one attempt to another could be attributable to just having taken the test before rather than in any improvement of underlying ability. Now, that is why the Law School Data Assembly Service, right, LS-DOS, had always averaged the LSAT scores of people who took the LSAT more than once. The second score might partly reflect that practice effect, even though, as I said before, the LSAT does have pretty good test-retest reliability. But certainly, schools are more and more taking the higher score only, certainly at least when they report their data on admitted students, because it helps them with the U.S. News rankings to have higher scores for admittees to the law school. Next, the instrumentation threat. Now, if the instrument of measurement changes over time, this can obviously influence the effect that is observed. So one example here is a law professor as an instrument of measurement. So what might some of the instrumentation threats be of our law professor instrument of measurement? Well, one is exams that are graded last. Maybe those are going to be graded more harshly than exams graded early because the professor is getting bored or angry. Or maybe the early exams, in fact, are graded more harshly because the professor is afraid of having too many high scores early in the process, so holds back on points. Or maybe the professor just got bad news, or the professor just had a fight with her husband. Or maybe the exams graded later in the evening after that third glass of wine start to sound better and better and make more and more sense. Now, that's why my method of grading is superior, at least I think. So before I start grading, I figure out exactly what aspects of a potential answer are going to earn points so that I try to make my essay question grading as objective as possible. The second one on the slide here, of course, there can be instrumentation threats in the use of a mechanical measuring device. So these can include the device changing over time just due to fatigue of certain metals in the device, like in the springs or other parts, or it can happen if the device is not properly calibrated before each measurement. Now, the example I have on the slide here, over here, is the infamous breathalyzer, which can have a huge instrumentation effect. These are often not calibrated correctly, sometimes not used correctly by law enforcement, Uh, and just as a side note on breathalyzers, there are other potential internal validity problems with breathalyzers in terms of whether they actually accurately reflect your blood alcohol level. For example, certain health conditions or eating a certain diet, or even having recently eaten a breath mint or used alcohol-based breath spray. Those all can have effects on breathalyzer readings. So the reading might reflect one of those effects and not, in fact, your ingestion of alcohol. Another instrumentation issue, getting back to people serving as the instruments, is that inter-rater variability problem that can affect reliability. One interesting one here, hospital patients. Hospital patients, they are obviously sort of around the clock evaluated by nurses, but they might be evaluated differently by different nurses on different shifts. And so the chart notes on a particular patient might look different when the patient really was in the same condition the whole time. And that's going to be due to different instruments doing those readings, right? Different nurses. The other one I have on this slide, you do have to worry a lot in research about cognitive biases, like expectancy bias, for example, that I have illustrated here. When you have an observer or a researcher, say, interviewing someone or watching something, that person might see or hear what he or she expects to see or hear, or that problem that we're going to talk about when we talk again about the battered woman research, battered woman syndrome research, is where researchers might change their behavior toward research subjects, and subjects might change their behavior toward the researcher due to these same expectations. So again, I told you we're going to talk about that a little bit in the context of the battered woman syndrome research. But there's another great example of this, and that is when researchers did an organizational effectiveness study in a big industrial plant. And what they wanted to do was institute several different organizational changes over time, just one at a time. And they wanted to see which of those organizational changes had a positive effect on the morale and the productivity of their employees. But it turned out that all the changes ended up having positive effects. And the suspicion ended up being that the employees were in fact really thriving on just getting so much attention. And they seemed to be motivated to help the researchers, or at least they were expecting that the changes that were being made should help their morale and productivity. So it became very difficult to figure out if any of the changes would really work long term. It's kind of interesting. It's almost like a placebo effect of an organizational change. So this is why, whenever possible, studies are conducted in a blind manner, right? You've heard that phrase, where research subjects don't know, for example, whether they're getting an active treatment or a placebo, or even better, when research is conducted in a double-blind manner where neither the research subjects nor the researchers know which group is receiving a particular treatment and which is getting a placebo. This is, of course, going to be much easier or much more difficult or even impossible depending upon the kind of research you have. It's easier to do a double-blind study if you're giving someone a pill where you can give them placebo pills and neither the researcher nor the patients know who's in what group. Much more difficult when you're talking about instituting organizational changes in an organization. All right, that is the end of video lecture number 6.